The neighbors in Millfield, Montana had given up calling the police about the strange woman living in the abandoned Hartwell property. What was the point? She wasn't technically breaking any laws, and the authorities had made it clear that, as long as she wasn't causing trouble, there wasn't much they could do. But what they witnessed through their kitchen windows each morning made their coffee taste bitter and their conversations fall silent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She moved like a shadow across the overgrown yard, her matted hair hanging in thick ropes down her back, her clothes, if you could call the tattered rags clothes, barely covering her skeletal frame. She foraged through garbage cans with the desperation of a starving animal, her fingers working quickly to extract anything remotely edible before scurrying back to whatever shelter she'd created for herself in the ruins of what was once a respectable farmhouse. Nobody knew her name, nobody knew her story. She was simply that woman who had appeared 3 years ago like a ghost materializing from the Montana wilderness. The boldest among the neighbors had tried approaching her once or twice in those early days, offering food or help, but she would bolt at the first sight of human contact, disappearing into the tall grass and broken structures with an agility that seemed impossible for someone so clearly malnourished. What the neighbors didn't know, what nobody could have imagined, was that this broken soul scratching out an existence in the dirt and debris was about to encounter someone who would see past the grime and fear of the woman buried beneath. Someone who understood that sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin in the darkest places. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Blackstone Ranch like a gentle embrace, and Carson Mitchell stood on his front porch, breathing in the crisp October air that carried the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. At 34, Carson had inherited more than just the 2,000-acre spread from his grandfather. He'd inherited the old man's belief that every living creature deserved compassion, even when the world had forgotten how to show it. Carson's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as he surveyed the land that had been in his family for 4 generations. The Blackstone Ranch wasn't the largest operation in the valley, but it was known for something more valuable than size: Carson Mitchell's reputation for taking in the horses that nobody else wanted. The ones that were too old, too injured, too traumatized, or too wild for other ranchers to bother with. His neighbors thought he was soft, maybe even foolish. Running a business based on charity cases and lost causes wasn't exactly a recipe for financial success. But Carson had learned something from his grandfather that most folks never figured out. Sometimes the most rewarding work happened when nobody was watching, when there was no profit to be made, when the only payment was the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd made a difference. The sound of his truck's engine warming up in the barn reminded Carson that he had business in town today. His foreman, Miguel Santos, had mentioned they were running low on feed, and Carson needed to pick up some medication for Thunder, an old stallion they'd rescued from a rodeo that had gone out of business. Thunder had been destined for the slaughterhouse when Carson intervened, and now the horse spent his retirement years peacefully grazing in the north pasture. His racing days long behind him, Carson finished his coffee and headed toward the barn, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. The familiar sounds of the ranch were already in full swing, horses nickering softly in their stalls, the rhythmic sound of hay being pitched, and Miguel's voice singing an old Mexican ballad as he worked. These were the sounds that had shaped Carson's childhood, the soundtrack of a life built around caring for creatures that couldn't care for themselves. The drive into Millfield took Carson along Highway 47, a winding 2-lane road that curved through some of the most beautiful country in Montana. He'd driven this route thousands of times, but he never tired of the view: endless stretches of golden grassland, interrupted by groves of aspen trees that turned brilliant yellow each fall, their leaves shimmering like coins in the morning sunlight. It was on this familiar drive that Carson first noticed something unusual near the old Hartwell place. The property had been abandoned for years, ever since old Henry Hartwell died and his city-dwelling children decided to let the place rot rather than invest in maintaining it. The house was a skeleton of its former self, with broken windows and a sagging roof that looked ready to collapse at any moment. But today, there was movement in the yard. Carson slowed his truck, squinting through the windshield to get a better look. At first, he thought it might be a deer or maybe a large dog picking through the debris scattered around the property. But as he pulled over to the shoulder of the road, he realized with a shock that it was a person, a woman, crawling on her hands and knees through the tall grass, her movements quick and nervous like those of a wild animal. She was impossibly thin, her dark hair so tangled and matted that it looked more like a nest than anything human. Her clothes were little more than rags torn and stained beyond recognition. As Carson watched, she suddenly froze, her head snapping up as if she'd sensed his presence. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Carson saw something in her gaze that made his chest tighten, a combination of fear, desperation, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Then she was gone, disappearing into the ruins of the farmhouse with a speed that left Carson questioning whether he'd really seen her at all. He sat in his truck for several long minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to process what he'd witnessed. Carson had spent his entire life around animals, and he recognized the signs of a creature that had been pushed beyond its limits, that had learned to survive on instinct alone. But this wasn't an animal, this was a human being, and the realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the October morning. Carson knew he should probably call someone's social services maybe, or the sheriff's department. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of his grandfather's voice, telling him that sometimes the most important help you could offer was the kind that came without strings attached, without bureaucracy, without the assumption that you knew what was best for someone else. Instead, Carson drove on to town, but his mind remained fixed on the image of the woman in the grass. He went through the motions of his errands, picking up the feed, collecting Thunder's medication, stopping by the hardware store for some supplies Miguel had requested, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that moment when their eyes had met. There had been intelligence in that gaze, buried beneath the fear and desperation. This wasn't someone who had chosen this life out of preference or mental illness. Carson was certain of that. This was someone who had been broken by circumstances he couldn't begin to imagine. Someone who had learned to survive by becoming something other than human. The drive back to the ranch took Carson past the Hartwell property again, and this time he slowed deliberately, hoping to catch another glimpse of the woman. The yard appeared empty, but Carson noticed details he'd missed before: a small garden plot hidden behind the house where someone had been growing vegetables, a makeshift shelter constructed from salvaged materials, tucked into the trees at the edge of the property. Someone was definitely living there, and they'd been living there for some time. That evening, Carson found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routine. He fed the horses mechanically, his mind elsewhere, and even Thunder seemed to sense his distraction, nuzzling Carson's shoulder with unusual gentleness as if trying to offer comfort. Miguel noticed Carson's preoccupation during dinner. The two men had worked together for 8 years, and Miguel had become more friend than employee, someone Carson trusted with both the ranch's business and his personal concerns. "You seem troubled tonight, my friend," Miguel said, setting down his fork and studying Carson's face across the kitchen table. "Something happened in town?" Carson hesitated, then described what he'd seen at the Hartwell place. Miguel listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more serious as Carson spoke. "I've heard rumors," Miguel said finally. "People in town, they whisper about someone living out there. The Martinez family, they live closest to that property, and Rosa. She says sometimes she sees someone going through their garbage at night." Take only food scraps, never anything valuable. How long has this been going on? 2, maybe 3 years. Rosa wanted to call the police, but her husband said that if someone is hungry enough to eat from garbage cans, maybe the police aren't. The answer. Carson nodded, appreciating the wisdom in that perspective. What do you think I should do? Miguel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window toward the darkening hills. My grandmother, she used to say that God puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe this woman, she's been waiting for someone who understands about taking care of broken things. That night, Carson lay awake staring at the ceiling, Miguel's words echoing in his mind. The ranch was full of animals that had been written off by the world horses that were too old, too damaged, or too difficult for anyone else to handle. Carson had built his entire life around the belief that every creature deserved a chance at dignity and peace, regardless of their past or their limitations. But this was different. This was a human being, and the complexities of helping a person were vastly different from rehabilitating a horse. There were legal considerations, social services protocols, and a dozen other complications that didn't exist when dealing with animals. Yet, Carson couldn't shake the memory of that brief moment when their eyes had met. In that instant, he'd seen something that reminded him of the horses he'd rescued over the years, that look of someone who had given up hope but hadn't quite given up fighting. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of low-hanging clouds that promised snow before the day was through. Carson went about his morning routine, but his thoughts kept drifting to the Hartwell property and the woman who was somehow surviving there as winter approached. After breakfast, Carson made a decision that would change everything. He loaded a box with basic supplies, canned food, bottled water, warm blankets, and a heavy winter coat that he'd never worn, and drove toward the abandoned farmhouse. His plan was simple: leave the supplies where she would find them, along with a note explaining that they were meant as a gift, with no strings attached. He wouldn't try to make contact or force any kind of interaction. He would simply offer help in the same way he might leave hay for wild horses during a harsh winter, an act of compassion that expected nothing in return. But as Carson approached the Hartwell property, he realized that his simple plan was about to become much more complicated. There, standing in the middle of the overgrown yard in broad daylight, was the woman he'd glimpsed the day before. And she was staring directly at his approaching truck, not with the fear he'd expected, but with something that looked almost like anticipation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Carson stopped his truck about 50 yards from where she stood, his heart pounding as he tried to decide what to do next. The woman didn't run. Instead, she watched him with an intensity that made Carson feel as if she were seeing something in him that he didn't even know existed. Slowly, Carson turned off the engine and opened his door, moving with the same careful deliberation he used when approaching a skittish horse. The woman tensed but held her ground, and Carson could see now just how thin she was, how the tattered clothes hung on her frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. But he could also see her eyes clearly for the first time, and what he saw there stopped him in his tracks. These weren't the vacant eyes of someone who had lost touch with reality. These were the eyes of someone who had been through hell and somehow retained their humanity. Someone who was watching him with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. Carson reached into the back of his truck and pulled out the box of supplies, setting it on the ground halfway between them. Then he stepped back, his hands visible and empty, waiting to see what would happen next. The woman looked at the box, then back at Carson, then at the box again. Her head tilted slightly, like a bird trying to understand something new and potentially dangerous. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there in the cold morning air, two humans trying to bridge a gap that seemed impossibly wide. Then, moving with the same quick, nervous energy Carson had observed the day before, The woman darted forward, grabbed the box, and retreated to what Carson now realized was a safe distance. She set the box down and began examining its contents, her movements becoming less frantic as she realized what she'd been given. When she looked up at Carson again, something had changed in her expression. The wariness was still there, but it was tempered now with something Carson recognized from years of working with traumatized animals, the first fragile stirring of trust. Carson nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that needed no words, then turned and walked back to his truck. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the woman still standing there, the box clutched against her chest, watching his truck disappear around the bend in the road. It was a beginning, Carson realized. Not the beginning he'd planned, but perhaps the beginning this broken woman had been waiting for without even knowing it. And as the first snowflakes began to fall against his windshield, Carson found himself thinking about what his grandfather would have said about this moment. Probably something about how the most important journeys always started with a single step into the unknown. The box sat untouched for 2 days. Carson drove past the Hartwell property twice during those first 48 hours, and each time he saw the cardboard container exactly where he'd left it, positioned halfway between the road and the ruins of the old farmhouse. On the third morning, when he made his deliberately casual pass on his way to check the fence line in the south pasture, the box was gone, but something else had taken its place. Where the supplies had been, someone had arranged a small pile of smooth river stones in what was unmistakably a deliberate pattern, a spiral that caught the morning light in a way that seemed almost artistic. Carson stopped his truck and stared at the simple display, feeling something shift in his chest. This wasn't just acknowledgement of his gift. It was a response, a form of communication that required no words but conveyed profound meaning. Someone was trying to say thank you. Carson continued his fence work, but his mind remained fixed on those carefully arranged stones. Over the years, he'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a traumatized horse was beginning to trust small changes in posture, slight modifications in behavior, the gradual willingness to accept human presence without panic. What he'd seen that morning felt remarkably similar, except this time it involved a human being who had somehow learned to survive outside the boundaries of normal society. That evening, Carson found himself sitting at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, trying to work out a plan. The approaching Montana winter would be brutal this year. The almanac was predicting one of the coldest seasons in decades, and whatever shelter the woman had created for herself wouldn't be sufficient for the months ahead. But rushing to help could easily destroy whatever fragile trust might be developing between them. Miguel knocked on the kitchen door just as Carson was sketching out possible approaches to the situation. The foreman's weathered face showed concern. As he settled into the chair across from Carson, his keen eyes taking in the notes and diagrams scattered across the table. "You're planning something," Miguel observed, his accent adding warmth to the words. "Something involving that woman you told me about." Carson nodded, then explained about the box, the stones, and his growing certainty that they were dealing with someone who needed help but might bolt at the first sign of conventional assistance. Miguel listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions that helped Carson clarify his own thinking. After nearly an hour of discussion, the older man leaned back in his chair and studied Carson with the kind of direct gaze that came from decades of reading both horses and humans. "My wife, she's been talking to Rosa Martinez," Miguel said. "Finally, the woman who lives closest to that abandoned place. Rosa, she has been watching more carefully since you mentioned seeing someone there." Carson felt his attention sharpen. What has she noticed? Small things, mostly. Someone has been repairing parts of that old house, not well, but with intelligence. There are vegetables growing in a hidden spot behind the building, planted with knowledge of soil and seasons. And Rosa, she says sometimes she hears singing late at night, very soft, like someone who doesn't want to be heard but can't help making music. The image of someone singing alone in the darkness struck Carson with unexpected force. It suggested a person who retained some connection to beauty, to joy. Despite living in circumstances that would break most people's spirits, there's something else, Miguel continued. Rosa's oldest daughter, Isabella, she's been leaving food scraps in a specific place near their property line. Not garbage, but good food wrapped carefully. And it's always gone by morning, taken with respect, no mess. Left behind, no damage to the area. Carson absorbed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together. The woman living at the Hartwell place wasn't simply surviving randomly. She was creating systems, building relationships or environment, and finding ways to maintain dignity even in desperate circumstances. "What do you think I should do?" Carson asked. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the table as he considered the question. "I think," he said finally, "that winter will force decisions that might be too dangerous to leave to chance. And I think this woman, she has already shown she understands kindness. Maybe it's time to offer her a choice instead of just supplies." The next morning, Carson loaded his truck with materials for a different kind of delivery. Instead of just food and basic necessities, he included items that would allow the woman to improve her living situation. Herself, if she chose to do so, a tarp that could provide better shelter, rope for securing structures, and basic tools that could be used for construction or repair. But most importantly, he included a simple handwritten note. "Winter is coming. If you need help building a stronger shelter, I know how to work with wood and stone. I'll be at the old Miller place every morning this week around 10 a.m., working on fence repairs. No pressure, no expectations." Carson left the supplies in the usual spot, but this time he included the spiral of stones he'd seen earlier, carefully reconstructed as closely as he could remember. It was his way of acknowledging the communication she'd attempted, of showing that he understood she was trying to reach out. The Miller place was a section of his ranch that bordered the Hartwell property, separated only by a broken fence line that had needed attention for months. Carson had been putting off the repair work, but now it provided the perfect excuse to be visible and accessible without being intrusive. For 3 days, he worked steadily on the fence, aware that he was probably being observed but seeing no sign of the woman. He fell into a rhythm of labor that was both productive and meditative, the familiar motions of post setting and wire stretching occupying his hands while his mind remained alert to any changes in his surroundings. On the 4th morning, Carson arrived at the worksite to find that someone had been there before him. His tools, which he'd left secured under a tarp, had been cleaned and organized with a precision that spoke of someone who understood the value of proper equipment maintenance. More significantly, several of the fence posts he'd been struggling to set properly had been adjusted during the night, positioned with an expertise that would have taken Carson hours to achieve. But it was the small carving left beside his toolbox that stopped Carson in his tracks. Whittled from a piece of scrap wood, it was unmistakably a representation of a horse crude in execution, but capturing something essential about the animal's spirit and grace. The message was clear. She had been watching him work, understanding what he did for a living, and responding with art. Carson spent that morning working more slowly than usual, taking time to appreciate the improvements that had been made to his fence line and considering what kind of person possessed both the practical skills to adjust fence posts and the artistic sensibility to create beauty from discarded wood. Around mid-morning, he became aware of being watched. Not the vague sense of observation he'd felt on previous days, but the definite presence of someone close enough to see details of his work. Carson continued repairing the fence, but he began talking quietly to himself, not loudly enough to seem like he was trying to communicate, but clear enough that someone listening might understand his words. "This old fence has been here since my grandfather's time," he said, addressing his comments to the wire he was tightening. He always said a good fence was like a good friendship. It needed regular attention to stay strong. But when you took care of it properly, it would last for generations. Carson paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. Grandpa used to say that the most important part of any fence wasn't the posts or the wire. It was understanding what you were trying to protect and what you were trying to keep out. Sometimes the same fence that protects something precious also keeps that precious thing isolated from the world. He resumed his work, but spoke again a few minutes later. The thing about working with horses is that they teach you patience. You can't force a horse to trust you. You have to prove that you're trustworthy, day after day, until they decide for themselves that you're safe. Some horses have been hurt so badly that it takes a very long time. But the ones that finally come around, they're often the most loyal companions you'll ever find. Carson finished repairing the section of fence he'd been working on, then began packing his tools with deliberate slowness. As he prepared to leave, he spoke once more to the morning air. "I'll be back tomorrow to work on the next section. These old fence lines need a lot of attention, and it's the kind of work that goes better when you're not in a hurry." That evening, Carson found himself thinking about the conversation he'd essentially had with himself that morning. But as he reflected on the words he'd chosen, he realized they'd been directed towards someone specific, even if that person had remained invisible. The next morning brought the first real breakthrough in their strange, wordless relationship. Carson arrived at the worksite to find not just clean tools and adjusted fence posts, but evidence that someone had been working alongside him during the night. A section of fence he hadn't even planned to repair had been completely rebuilt with materials obviously salvaged from other parts of the property, but assembled with skill and attention to detail that impressed Carson's professional eye. More remarkably, the unknown helper had left a written message, the first direct communication Carson had received beyond the artistic offerings. Written on a piece of cardboard in careful, educated handwriting were the words, "Thank you for the supplies. Thank you for not making me afraid." Carson read the message 3 times, struck by both the clarity of the writing and the profound sadness embedded in that last phrase. What kind of experiences had taught someone that basic human kindness was something to be feared rather than expected? He spent the morning working on fence repairs, but his attention was divided between the task at hand and the growing certainty that he was in the early stages of something much more significant than he'd initially understood. This wasn't just about helping someone through a difficult winter. It was about creating the possibility for a human being to rejoin a world she'd obviously been forced to leave behind. When Carson finished his work that day, he left his own written response tucked securely under a stone where it would be protected from weather but easily found. "You don't ever have to be afraid of me. I understand about need for time and space. I'll keep working on this fence for as long as it takes. And you're welcome to help or just watch or stay hidden, whatever feels safe to you." The following morning, Carson arrived to find that his note had been replaced with a longer message. "I used to know about fences and horses and the kind of life you live. I've forgotten how to be around people, but I remember watching horses learn to trust. Would it be possible for me to learn the same way?" Carson felt something tight and painful in his chest as he read those words. The message spoke of loss that went far beyond physical hardship. It revealed someone who had once lived differently, who possessed knowledge and memories of a world she'd been forced to abandon. His response was simple. "Yes, we can take as much of the much time as you need." And for the first time since this strange relationship had begun, Carson signed his name to the message. Over the following days, their written exchanges became more frequent and more revealing. Carson learned the woman had extensive knowledge of agriculture, animal husbandry, and rural life. She asked intelligent questions about his ranch operations and offered suggestions for fence construction that proved remarkably insightful. Most importantly, she began to hint at her own story, not directly, but through comments that suggested a past life that had included education, resources, and connections to the kind of community she now observed from a distance. "I used to have horses," she wrote in one message. "I used to have a lot of things. Sometimes I dream about grooming a horse and wake up disappointed that my hands are empty." Carson's response was immediate and heartfelt. There are horses here who would benefit from gentle hands, and someone who understands their nature. When you're ready, you're welcome to meet them. The invitation hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Carson sensed that her answer would determine not just the immediate future of their relationship, but the direction of whatever journey she was preparing to undertake back toward the world of human connection. Her response came 2 days later, written in handwriting that seemed to tremble slightly with emotion. "I would like that very much. But I need you to know that I might not be ready to be seeing clearly yet. Would it be possible to meet your horses before I meet any more people?" Carson smiled as he read her careful words, understanding perfectly what she was asking. She wanted to test the waters of trust with creatures who wouldn't judge her appearance or ask questions about her past. "Absolutely," he wrote back. "Horses are excellent teachers about trust and patience. They'll help you remember what you already know." As Carson folded the note and prepared to leave it in their established communication spot, he realized that they were about to cross a threshold that would change everything. Soon, this hidden woman would step into his world, and he would have the privilege of witnessing her first tentative steps back toward the life she'd lost. The thought filled him with both anticipation and a profound sense of responsibility. Whatever had driven her into hiding had wounded her deeply, but Carson was beginning to suspect that beneath the fear and isolation was someone remarkable, someone who might, with patience and respect, remember how to trust the world again. Meeting was arranged for dawn on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the ranch would be quiet and the chances of encountering Miguel or any of the part-time workers would be minimal. Carson had chosen Meadow, a gentle bay mare with kind eyes and infinite patience, as the perfect introduction to his world of rescued horses. He arrived at the north pasture before sunrise, leading Meadow to a spot near the fence line where the woman could observe from the safety of the neighboring property if she chose. The mare grazed contentedly while Carson sat on an overturned feed bucket, sipping coffee from a thermos and watching the eastern horizon lighten from deep purple to pale gold. At exactly 6 a.m., Carson caught a glimpse of movement in the tall grass beyond the fence. She was there, he realized, but maintaining the distance that felt safe to her. Carson continued his morning routine as if he were alone, speaking softly to Meadow about nothing in particular while the mare explored the new grazing area. For nearly an hour, nothing changed. Carson groomed Meadow with slow, deliberate strokes, explaining to the horse what he was doing in the same gentle tone he'd used during their written correspondence. "This is the currycomb, girl. See how it loosens the dirt and old hair? Makes you feel better, doesn't it?" It was Meadow who initiated the first real contact. The mare suddenly lifted her head and looked directly toward the fence line, her ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. She nickered softly, the low-sound horses used to greet each other, and took several steps toward the property boundary. Carson followed Meadow's gaze and saw the woman standing just visible among the trees, no longer hiding but not yet approaching. She was staring at the horse with an expression Carson recognized from his work with animals, the look of someone remembering something precious they thought they'd lost forever. "She likes you," Carson called out, keeping his voice low and conversational. "Meadow has good instincts about people. She's been here 3 years now, came to us from a stable that went out of business. The owner was going to send her to auction, but she was too old to bring much money." Carson saw the woman take a step closer to the fence, her attention entirely focused on the horse. Meadow responded by moving nearer to the boundary between properties until only the broken fence line separated them. Would you like to say hello to her? Carson asked, then immediately added, You don't have to come any closer than feels comfortable. Meadow understands about taking things slowly. For a long moment, the woman remained motionless. Then, moving with the careful deliberation Carson had observed in all her actions, she approached the fence line. Meadow stretched her neck toward the newcomer, and Carson watched as years of fear seemed to melt away from the woman's face. She reached out tentatively, her fingers barely brushing Meadow's soft muzzle. The contact lasted only seconds before she pulled back, but something fundamental had shifted. Carson saw tears running down her cheeks, the first emotion she'd displayed openly since he'd known her. She remembers, the woman whispered, and Carson realized these were the first words he'd heard her speak aloud. Her voice was cultured, educated, with the slight roughness that came from years of disuse, but none of the coarseness he might have expected from someone living as she had. It was the voice of someone who had once moved comfortably through a very different world. She remembers what? Carson asked gently. How to be loved, the woman replied, reaching out to touch Meadow again. This time with more confidence. I had forgotten that animals don't judge, don't ask questions, don't need explanations for why someone looks the way I do. Carson watched as the woman's interaction with Meadow became more natural, her movements taking on the fluid grace of someone who had indeed spent significant time around horses. She knew exactly where to scratch to make Meadow lean into the contact, understood the subtle body language that indicated the mare's contentment. You weren't exaggerating when you said you used to have horses, Carson observed, the woman's hands stilled for a moment, and Carson worried he'd pushed too hard too fast. But then she resumed stroking Meadow's neck and spoke without looking at him. I had a breeding operation. Quarter horses mostly, with some thoroughbreds. 43 horses at the peak, on 800 acres in Virginia. Her voice carried a mixture of pride and pain. I knew bloodlines, conformation, training methods. I could spot a champion from across a pasture. Carson felt his understanding of her situation shift dramatically. This wasn't someone who had fallen through society's cracks due to mental illness or addiction. This was someone who had operated at a high level in the same world Carson inhabited. Someone who had lost everything and somehow ended up living like a wild creature in Montana. What happened? He asked, then immediately regretted the direct question, but the woman seemed ready to share at least part of her story. My husband, she said simply, Marcus Fairfield. You might have heard of him. He was involved in some high-profile horse racing scandals about 5 years ago. Carson had indeed heard the name, though he couldn't immediately recall the specifics. The horse racing world was relatively small, and scandals involving major players tended to reverberate through the entire industry. When the federal investigation started, Marcus disappeared, she continued, her voice becoming more distant. Left me to face the authorities, the creditors, the media. Everything we owned was seized or sold to pay debts and legal fees. I lost the farm, the horses, my home, everything except the clothes I was wearing, and my truck. Carson began to understand the scope of her fall from grace. How did you end up in Montana? I drove, she said, managing a bitter smile. Just kept driving west until the truck broke down outside Millfield. I had exactly $37 left, no credit cards that worked, no family to call for help. The truck was worthless, so I abandoned it and walked until I found a place where no one would look for me. The story was beginning to make horrifying sense to Carson. The woman, Elena, he now knew had essentially been erased from her former life, left to start over with nothing except the knowledge and skills she carried in her head. Why didn't you try to rebuild somewhere else? Carson asked. With your experience, you could have found work in the horse industry. Elena's laugh was harsh and painful to hear. Have you ever tried to get a job when the first result of any internet search of your name links you to federal fraud investigations? When your former business partners won't return your calls because they're afraid of being associated with you? When you have no references because everyone you knew professionally considers you toxic? Carson felt a surge of anger on her behalf. He'd seen enough of the horse world's politics to understand how quickly the community could turn against someone. Perceived as a liability, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. "So you decided to disappear completely," he said. "I decided to survive," Elena corrected. "At first, I thought it would be temporary, just until I could figure out how to clear my name or find some way back into legitimate life. But months turned into years, and I realized I'd been gone so long that I'd forgotten how to be around people who didn't want something from me or weren't afraid of me." Meadow had been listening to their conversation with the patient attention horses often showed during human discussions, occasionally nuzzling Elena's shoulder as if offering comfort. Now the Mari moved closer to the fence, positioning herself so that Elena could reach more of her neck and shoulder. "She knows you need this," Carson observed, watching Elena's posture relax as she worked her fingers through Meadow's mane. "Horses always know," Elena agreed. "They understand trauma, fear, the need for gentle contact. People complicate everything with words and expectations and judgments. Horses just offer what they have and accept what you can give." Carson found himself studying Elena more carefully as she worked with Meadow. Beneath the effects of malnutrition and years of outdoor living, he could see traces of the successful businesswoman she had once been. Her bone structure was elegant. Her movements carried unconscious authority, and her knowledge of horses was immediately apparent in every interaction. "Elena," Carson said carefully, "would you be interested in spending more time with the horses? Not as work, not as charity, just as something that might help you remember who you are beneath all the things that happened to you." Elena's hands stilled again, and Carson could see her weighing the risks of accepting his offer. Spending time at the ranch would mean increased human contact, greater visibility, the possibility that someone might eventually recognize her or connect her to her past, but it would also mean regular interaction with animals that understood her, work that utilized skills she'd thought she'd lost, and perhaps most importantly, a reason to hope that her life might contain something more than mere survival. "I would need to be careful," she said finally. "There are still people looking for me, creditors, possibly federal agents, definitely reporters who think there's still a story to be found. If I'm discovered..." "What if we started very small?" Carson suggested. "Early morning visits when the ranch is quiet. You could work with the horses that need rehabilitation, the ones that are too damaged or too difficult for most people to handle. They might benefit from someone who understands what it's like to have your trust completely broken." Elena looked at Carson directly for the first time since their conversation had begun, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark of possibility, of interest in something beyond mere existence. "You have horses like that?" "Several," Carson confirmed. "There's Thunder, who came from a rodeo operation that abused him for years. He won't let most people near him, but he desperately needs someone with the patience and skill to help him learn that not all humans want to hurt him. There's Luna, a Mare who was rescued from a hoarding situation. She's so traumatized by crowded conditions that she can't be in the main pasture with the other horses." As Carson described his most challenging rescues, he watched Elena's expression change. The fear and wariness that had defined her features for so long was being replaced by something that looked almost like hunger, not for food, but for purpose, for the chance to use her knowledge and skills in service of creatures that needed exactly what she had to offer. "They would understand me," Elena said quietly. "And you would understand them," Carson agreed. "Sometimes the best healing happens when broken things help other broken things remember how to be whole." Elena spent another hour with Meadow, and Carson watched her confidence grow with each passing minute. By the time she finally stepped back from the fence, she was moving with some of the fluid grace he imagined she'd possessed in her former life. "Tomorrow?" she asked as she prepared to disappear back into the woods. "Tomorrow," Carson confirmed. Same time, same place. And Elena? Thank you for trusting me with your story. Elena nodded once, then paused before leaving. Carson? When I worked with horses before, I was good at it. Really good. I want you to know that what you're offering me, it's not charity. If I can help your damaged horses, then we're both getting something valuable from this arrangement. As Carson watched Elena fade back into the forest, he realized that her last comment revealed something crucial about her character. Even after years of living in desperate circumstances, she had retained enough pride and self-respect to insist on contributing rather than simply receiving help. That evening, as Carson sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains, he found himself thinking about the conversation they'd had. Elena's story was a stark reminder of how quickly someone's entire world could collapse, how easily a person could fall through the cracks of society and disappear completely. But it was also a story about resilience, about the human capacity to survive unthinkable circumstances and somehow retain the essential elements of identity and dignity. Elena had lost everything that defined her external life, but she had somehow preserved the knowledge, skills, and compassion that made her who she truly was. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. For Elena, it would be the first step back toward a life that included purpose and human connection. For Carson, it would be the beginning of understanding just how much healing could happen when two damaged souls, human and animal, were given the chance to help each other remember what wholeness felt like. As he prepared for bed that night, Carson found himself looking forward to dawn with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow he would have the privilege of watching Elena begin to reclaim not just her skills with horses, but her sense of herself as someone worthy of respect, purpose, and perhaps eventually, a place in the world again. Elena arrived at the ranch the next morning carrying something Carson hadn't expected, a small canvas bag that looked like it had seen better days, but was obviously carefully maintained. When she set it down near the fence, he caught a glimpse of its contents. Brushes, hoof picks, and other grooming tools that had clearly been well used and lovingly preserved. I managed to save a few things when everything fell apart, Elena explained, noticing his curious glance. I couldn't bear to sell these. They were the last connection to who I used to be. Carson felt a tightness in his throat as he realized what those tools represented. In her darkest moments, when she'd lost everything else that defined her life, Elena had held onto the instruments of her craft. They were more than grooming supplies. They were talismans of hope, physical proof that somewhere beneath the survival and fear, she still believed she might someday work with horses again. Today's introduction was to Thunder, the 17-year-old stallion Carson had rescued from the bankrupt rodeo operation. The horse stood at the far end of the small paddock, his coat dull despite regular grooming, his eyes holding the wary distance that spoke of too many betrayals by human hands. Tell me about him, Elena said, studying Thunder with the focused attention of a professional evaluating a difficult case. 15 years in rodeo, Carson began. Started as a bucking horse when he was just barely broke. Moved through various rough stock operations until his owners decided he wasn't providing enough of a challenge for experienced riders. The last place I found him, they were using electric prods and other methods I won't describe to make him more aggressive. Elena's jaw tightened. Physical abuse creates behavioral problems that can take years to undo, if they can be undone at all. Exactly. Thunder hasn't let anyone touch him willingly since he arrived here 8 months ago. We've been able to provide basic care only by using squeeze chutes and restraints, which obviously doesn't help his trust issues. Elena opened her canvas bag and selected a soft brush, testing its bristles against her palm with the automatic gesture of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. Has anyone tried just being present with him? Not asking for anything, not trying to accomplish any specific goal? Miguel and I have spent hours in his paddock, but Thunder maintains his distance. We can't get closer than about 15 feet before he moves away. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Traumatized horses often need to study humans for a long time before. They're willing to risk any kind of interaction. They have to believe that this person is fundamentally different from the ones who hurt them. She approached the paddock fence slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Thunder's head came up immediately, his ears pinned back in warning, but Elena stopped well outside his comfort zone and simply stood quietly. For the next hour, Elena did something Carson had never seen attempted with Thunder, absolutely nothing. She didn't try to approach, didn't attempt to entice the horse with food or soft words, didn't even look directly at him for more than brief moments. Instead, she positioned herself near the fence and began the meditative process of cleaning and organizing her grooming tools, her actions calm and repetitive. Carson watched, fascinated, as Thunder's behavior gradually changed. The horse's ears came forward as he studied this new human who seemed to pose no threat. His tense posture relaxed slightly as Elena continued her quiet work, and after about 40 minutes, he took his first tentative steps toward the fence. "He's curious," Elena murmured without looking up from the brush she was cleaning. Curiosity is the first step toward trust. By the end of the session, Thunder had approached within 10 feet of where Elena sat, closer than he'd voluntarily come to any human since arriving at the ranch. When Elena finally packed up her tools and prepared to leave, the horse actually followed her movement along the fence line as if reluctant to see her go. "Tomorrow," Elena told Carson, "I'll bring a book." Sometimes horses relax more when they can observe human activities that have nothing to do with them. It removes the pressure of interaction while still providing the opportunity to study and evaluate. Over the following weeks, Elena's morning sessions with Thunder became a masterclass in patience and understanding that left Carson in awe of her skill. She progressed from reading quietly near his paddock to eventually sitting inside the enclosure, always positioning herself so that Thunder could retreat if he felt overwhelmed. The breakthrough came on a foggy morning in early November, when Elena arrived to find Thunder standing near the gate, as if he'd been waiting for her. For the first time, when she entered his paddock, the horse didn't move away. Instead, he stood motionless as Elena settled into her usual spot and began reading aloud from a collection of poetry she'd found in the abandoned farmhouse. The poems seemed to calm him, Elena explained to Carson afterward. The rhythm of language, the predictable cadence, it's soothing to horses who have learned to fear sudden movements or harsh voices. 20 minutes into her reading, Thunder took a step closer to Elena, then another. Carson held his breath as the horse that had refused all human contact for 8 months slowly approached the woman who had somehow convinced him that trust might be possible again. When Thunder finally stretched his neck toward Elena, allowing her to touch his muzzle for the first time, Carson saw tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of a professional who had rediscovered her calling, of a woman who was remembering what it felt like to be truly needed. "He knows I understand," Elena whispered as Thunder allowed her to stroke his neck. "He can sense that I've been broken too." Elena's success with Thunder opened doors to working with other horses at the ranch. Luna, the mare traumatized by hoarding conditions, responded to Elena's patient approach with surprising speed. Storm, a gelding who had been rescued from a neglectful situation where he'd been kept in isolation, began seeking Elena's attention actively after just a few sessions, but it was Elena's work with a newly arrived horse that truly demonstrated the depth of her expertise and the extent of her healing. Duchess was a thoroughbred mare who had been rescued from an illegal racing operation where horses were routinely drugged and overworked. When she arrived at the ranch, she was physically and emotionally shattered, underweight, injured, and so fearful of humans that she would injure herself trying to escape any enclosure that contained people. Most rescue operations would have recommended euthanasia for a horse as damaged as the Duchess. The Mare's terror was so complete that she seemed incapable of accepting even basic care, let alone rehabilitation. Elena took one look at the Duchess and saw something others had missed. "She's not just afraid," Elena told Carson after observing the Mare for several days. "She's confused. I think she's been drugged so extensively that she doesn't trust her own perceptions anymore. Everything feels dangerous to her because she can't distinguish between real threats and chemically induced paranoia." Elena's approach to Duchess was unlike anything Carson had witnessed, even after weeks of watching her work with other difficult horses. Instead of trying to interact with the Mare directly, Elena focused on creating an environment of absolute predictability and safety. She established a routine where she would arrive at the same time each day, perform the same sequence of activities in the same order, and maintain the same calm energy throughout her presence. Elena never attempted to approach Duchess directly, but instead worked on creating positive associations with human presence. She would arrive with fresh hay and clean water, which she would place in Duchess's paddock using long-handled tools that kept her at a safe distance. Then Elena would position herself outside the enclosure and begin grooming other horses where the Duchess could observe but not feel threatened. Traumatized horses need to relearn that humans can be predictable and safe, Elena explained. The Duchess has to literally retrain her brain to recognize normal horse-human interactions before she can participate in them. The process was painstakingly slow. For 2 weeks, Duchess would retreat to the farthest corner of her paddock whenever Elena appeared, emerging only after the woman had left to investigate the hay and water that had been provided. But Elena persisted, with the same patient determination she'd shown with Thunder. Gradually, the Duchess began to anticipate Elena's arrivals, positioning herself where she could observe the daily routine without feeling completely exposed. The first major breakthrough came when the Duchess began eating while Elena was present in the adjacent paddock. It was a small step, but for a horse who had been too terrified to eat in the presence of humans, it represented enormous progress. Elena's dedication to the horses was matched by her growing integration into the ranch's daily operations. Miguel had initially been skeptical of Carson's decision to involve an unknown woman in their work, but Elena's obvious expertise and gentle effectiveness with the most difficult cases quickly won his respect. "She has a gift," Miguel told Carson. One evening as they watched Elena working with a group of horses in the main pasture, not just knowledge gift. The horses, they recognize something in her that makes them want to trust again. Carson had noticed the same thing. Elena seemed to communicate with horses on a level that went beyond technique or training methods. She understood their emotional states intuitively, responding to subtle cues that other people might miss entirely. But, perhaps more importantly, Carson could see Elena herself changing as she rediscovered her purpose. The constant wariness that had defined her movements was gradually being replaced by confidence. She stood straighter, moved with more authority, and began offering opinions and suggestions about ranch operations with increasing frequency. "Carson," Elena said one afternoon as they watched Duchess cautiously approach the paddock fence where Elena stood, "I've been thinking about expanding the rehabilitation program. With the right approach, you could help horses that other rescue operations consider hopeless." Carson felt his heart rate increase as he recognized what Elena was really saying. She wasn't just volunteering to help with a few difficult horses. She was envisioning a future where she played a central role in developing and implementing a comprehensive program for traumatized animals. That would require someone with specialized knowledge to oversee the program. Carson said carefully. Elena met his gaze directly. It would require someone who understands trauma from the inside, who has the technical knowledge to develop effective protocols, and who has the patience to see each case through to completion, regardless of how long it takes. "Someone like you. Someone exactly like me," Elena agreed. Carson, I know I'm not exactly a conventional candidate for employment. I have no current references, no fixed address, and a complicated past that makes me a potential liability. But I also have 15 years of professional experience with difficult horses, and I understand what it means to be written off by the world. Carson studied Elena's face, seeing not the desperate woman who had been foraging through garbage just months earlier, but a consummate professional who was offering to share her expertise in service of animals that needed exactly what she had to offer. There would be challenges, Carson said. Legal issues around employment, questions about your background if anyone inquired, practical concerns about housing and integration into the community. I understand the risks, Elena replied. But Carson, I've spent 5 years just surviving. I'm ready to live again, even if it means accepting some level of risk. These horses need what I can give them, and I need the chance to be useful again. As if summoned by their conversation, Duchess approached the fence where they stood. The mare's movements were still cautious, but she no longer fled at the sight of humans. Instead, she studied Elena with the focused attention of a horse trying to solve a puzzle. Elena reached slowly into her pocket and produced a small apple, which she placed on the fence post nearest to Duchess before stepping back several paces. The mare approached cautiously, investigated the offering, then looked directly at Elena as if recognizing the gift for what it was, an act of respect rather than an attempt at manipulation. She's learning to trust again, Elena said quietly. Just like I am. Carson watched as Elena extended her hand toward Duchess, palm up and motionless, allowing the mare to decide whether to accept the contact. After a long moment of consideration, Duchess stretched her neck forward and gently touched Elena's fingertips with her muzzle dot. In that simple gesture, Carson saw the culmination of months of patient work and the promise of transformation that extended far beyond a single horse. Elena had not only helped Duchess begin to heal, she had demonstrated her own readiness to step back into a world where her skills and knowledge could make a real difference. Elena, Carson said, I think we need to talk about making this arrangement more permanent. The smile that crossed Elena's face was radiant with hope and possibility. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked like someone who believed the future might hold something better than mere survival. I would like that very much, she replied, and Carson knew that both of their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could fully imagine. The conversation about Elena's permanent employment took place on a crisp December evening in Carson's kitchen, with legal documents spread across the worn wooden table and the warm glow of lamplight, making the whole scene feel both momentous and intimate. Elena had spent the afternoon preparing for this discussion, gathering the few official documents she still possessed and mentally rehearsing how to explain the complexities of her situation. The biggest challenge will be employment verification, Elena said, pointing to a section of the paperwork Carson had obtained from his lawyer. I can't provide recent references without potentially exposing my location to people who might still be looking for me. And I can't use my real Social Security number for tax purposes without creating a digital trail. Carson had anticipated this problem. My lawyer suggests we structure this as a consulting arrangement initially. You'd be an independent contractor, specializing in equine rehabilitation, which gives us more flexibility in terms of documentation requirements. Elena studied the proposed contract, her business experience evident in how quickly she grasped the legal implications. This protects you if my past catches up with me, she observed. If anyone comes looking for Elena Fairfield, you can truthfully say you've never employed anyone by that name. It also protects you, Carson replied. As a contractor, you maintain more control over your working conditions and can establish clear boundaries about what information you're comfortable sharing. The practical arrangements were more complex than either of them had initially realized. Elena needed a permanent address for official purposes, but returning to conventional housing felt impossibly dangerous after years of invisibility. Carson's solution was characteristically thoughtful. He would construct a small, private cabin on a remote section of his property, officially designated as contractor housing, but designed to meet Elena's specific needs for both comfort and security. "I'll need to be able to leave quickly if necessary," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to always have an escape plan. "Not because I don't trust you, but because the people from my past won't hesitate to destroy anyone who's helped me if they think it will lead them to assets they believe I'm hiding." Carson felt a chill as he realized Elena's fears weren't paranoia, but educated assessment of real danger. What exactly are they looking for? Elena hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision about how much to reveal. "Before Marcus disappeared, he liquidated several accounts and sold assets without my knowledge. The authorities believe he took approximately $2 million, and they think I either helped him hide it or know where he went. Neither is true, but convincing them of that would require me to surface and submit to interrogation. I'm not sure I'd survive." The number hit Carson like a physical blow. $2 million represented more money than most people saw in a lifetime, certainly enough to motivate prolonged searches and serious consequences for anyone found to be obstructing justice. "Elena," Carson said carefully, "are you absolutely certain you don't know anything about this money?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "Carson, if I had access to $2 million, do you think I would have spent 5 years eating from garbage cans and sleeping in abandoned buildings? Marcus left me with nothing less than nothing, because I was responsible for debts I didn't even know existed." Carson believed her completely. The woman he'd come to know was many things: intelligent, skilled, resilient, proud, but she wasn't a liar. If Elena had access to hidden wealth, she would never have endured the degradation and danger of her recent life. "Then we'll be very careful," Carson said. "The contractor arrangement, the remote cabin, minimal digital footprint. You'll essentially remain invisible while still being able to work legally." Elena nodded, but Carson could see the emotional cost of maintaining such extreme caution. "I hate that my problems might create risks for you and Miguel and everyone connected to this ranch. You're offering me a chance at a real life again, and I'm bringing complications that could endanger everything you've built." "Elena," Carson said firmly, "what you're bringing is expertise that could transform our rescue program and help horses that no one else knows how to reach. The complications are manageable. The value of what you offer is immeasurable." Construction of Elena's cabin began the following week, with Carson and Miguel working together to create something that was both functional and secure. The location they chose was perfect, nestled in a grove of pine trees about a quarter-mile from the main house, accessible by a service road but invisible from any public thoroughfare. Elena participated in every aspect of the construction, her input revealing yet another dimension of her capabilities. She understood building techniques, electrical systems, and plumbing in ways that spoke of hands-on experience with property management. "I designed and oversaw construction of several buildings on our Virginia farm," Elena explained when Carson commented on her knowledge. "Barns, riding arenas, a guest house. I learned that if you want something done right, you need to understand every aspect of the process yourself." The cabin they built together was modest but perfectly suited to Elena's needs. A single large room with high ceilings and extensive windows that provided both natural light and clear sight lines to all approaches. A compact kitchen area with modern appliances. A sleeping loft accessible by a steep staircase that could be quickly blocked if necessary. And most importantly, multiple exit routes, including a back door that opened onto a path leading deep into the forest. But it was the small details that revealed how much thought Carson had put into making Elena feel safe and welcome. A wood-burning stove positioned to provide both warmth and a means of destroying documents quickly if needed. Shelving designed to display the few personal items Elena had managed to preserve. a small office area where she could develop rehabilitation protocols and maintain records without fear of discovery. Elena's integration into the ranch's daily operations proceeded gradually but steadily. Carson had decided to introduce her to his wider circle of contacts slowly, beginning with Dr. Sarah Chun, the veterinarian who provided medical care for the rescue horses. Dr. Chun is completely trustworthy, Carson assured Elena as they prepared for the meeting. She's been working with rescue animals for 15 years, and she understands that some situations require discretion. Dr. Chun's reaction to Elena was everything Carson had hoped for and more. Within minutes of watching Elena work with Duchess, the veterinarian was asking detailed questions about rehabilitation techniques and expressing amazement at the progress the traumatized Mare had made. "I've seen horses with similar backgrounds," Dr. Chun told Elena, "and most never recover enough to be safely handled, let alone ridden. What you've accomplished with Duchess is extraordinary." Elena's response revealed both her professional pride and her continued caution. Traumatized horses need someone who understands that healing happens in stages, and that pushing too fast often causes setbacks that can be permanent. The key is creating an environment where the horse can choose to trust rather than being forced into compliance. Dr. Chun spent the rest of her visit discussing complex cases with Elena, and Carson could see both women's excitement as they shared expertise and explored new approaches to difficult problems. By the time Dr. Chun left, she had unofficially become part of Elena's support network, someone who understood the value of her work without needing to know the details of her background. Elena's first major test as an official contractor came when Carson received a call about a horse that multiple rescue organizations had deemed unsalvageable. Phoenix was a young stallion who had been seized from a suspected animal fighting operation, where horses were apparently used in illegal gladiator-style contests that left survivors physically and psychologically destroyed. "The authorities want to euthanize him," Carson explained to Elena. 3 different rescue organizations have evaluated Phoenix and concluded that he's too dangerous to rehabilitate. They're giving us 1 week to demonstrate progress before they proceed with destruction. Elena studied the photos and veterinary reports Carson had received, her expression growing more grim as she absorbed the details of Phoenix's condition. The horse had been systematically brutalized to enhance his aggression, subjected to methods that created a level of trauma Carson had never encountered. "This isn't just abuse," Elena said quietly. "This is deliberate psychological destruction, designed to turn a naturally gentle animal into a weapon. Phoenix doesn't just fear humans, he's been conditioned to attack them." Carson felt his heart sink as he realized the magnitude of the challenge they were accepting. "Elena, if you think this is too dangerous, we can decline. I won't ask you to risk your safety, even for a horse that needs help." Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs with the focused attention of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. When she finally spoke, her voice carried absolute determination. "Carson, 5 years ago, experts looked at my situation and concluded I was too damaged to be saved. They wrote me off as a casualty of circumstances beyond repair. I survived because one person was willing to see possibility where others saw only problems." She set down the photographs and looked at Carson directly. "Phoenix deserves the same chance I received. If we can't save him, at least he'll spend his last days being treated with dignity instead of being destroyed out of convenience." The decision to accept Phoenix's case required extensive preparation. Elena spent days developing a detailed protocol for initial assessment and gradual introduction that prioritized everyone's safety while maximizing the horse's chances for recovery. "We'll need to modify the quarantine paddock," Elena explained to Carson and Miguel. "Higher fences, reinforced gates, and a separate observation area where we can study his behavior without triggering defensive responses." Elena also insisted on establishing clear emergency procedures. If Phoenix shows signs of imminent attack, Everyone needs to know exactly how to retreat safely. And we need Dr. Chen on standby in case someone gets injured, despite our precautions. Phoenix arrived. On a gray January morning, transported in a specialized trailer designed for handling extremely dangerous horses. Elena watched from a safe distance as the transport team used elaborate precautions to move the stallion from the trailer to his specially prepared enclosure. Even from 50 yards away, Carson could see that Phoenix was unlike any horse he'd ever encountered. The stallion's movements were tense and predatory, his eyes constantly scanning for threats or opportunities to attack. When he noticed the humans observing him, Phoenix charged the fence with such violence that the reinforced panels shook under the impact. He's been trained to view humans as either threats to be destroyed or tools to be dominated, Elena observed, making notes about Phoenix's behavior patterns. Traditional rehabilitation approaches won't work because they assume the horse retains some natural desire for peaceful coexistence. Elena's initial approach to Phoenix was unlike anything Carson had seen her attempt with other horses. Instead of trying to create positive associations with human presence, she focused on simply demonstrating that she was neither threat nor victim. For the first week, Elena positioned herself outside Phoenix's paddock, but made no attempt at interaction. Instead, she used the time to document his behavior patterns, identifying triggers that increased his aggression and noting the few moments when he seemed marginally less defensive. He's constantly hypervigilant, Elena explained to Carson after several days of observation. Phoenix can't relax because he's been conditioned to expect attack at any moment. Before we can work on rehabilitation, we need to help him remember what it feels like to be safe. Elena's breakthrough insight came during her second week with Phoenix, when she noticed that the stallion seemed slightly calmer during feeding times. Not because he was distracted by food, but because eating represented one of the few activities from his past that hadn't been weaponized by his abusers. Food is still just food to him, Elena realized. It's the one human interaction that retains positive associations because even his abusers needed him healthy enough to fight. Elena began incorporating feeding into her presence near Phoenix's paddock, but with a crucial modification. Instead of simply providing meals, she created elaborate food puzzles that required Phoenix to work for his nutrition. The mental engagement seemed to provide relief from his constant vigilance, creating brief windows when he was focused on problem-solving rather than threat assessment. Intellectual stimulation is like meditation for intelligent horses, Elena explained as they watched Phoenix manipulate a complex feeding device she'd constructed. It gives his mind something productive to focus on instead of constantly scanning for dangers. The feeding puzzles became Elena's bridge to Phoenix's consciousness. Over time, she was able to increase the complexity of the challenges, requiring Phoenix to interact with objects she had handled, to accept her proximity during feeding, and eventually to tolerate her presence inside his paddock while he ate. Carson watched these sessions with a mixture of admiration and anxiety, knowing that Elena was literally betting her life on her ability to read Phoenix's intentions accurately. One miscalculation, one moment of inattention, and the stallion could inflict injuries that would be life-threatening. But Elena's confidence was based on deep understanding rather than reckless optimism. She had studied Phoenix's behavioral patterns so thoroughly that she could predict his responses with remarkable accuracy, knowing exactly how far to push and when to retreat. 3 weeks into the rehabilitation process, Elena achieved something that astonished everyone involved in Phoenix's care. The stallion, who had been written off as irredeemably vicious, allowed Elena to touch his shoulder while he ate. It was the briefest contact, her fingertips against his neck for perhaps 3 seconds, but it represented a monumental breakthrough. Phoenix had made a conscious choice to tolerate human contact, demonstrating that somewhere beneath the conditioned aggression, he retained the capacity to distinguish between threat and safety. "He's remembering," Elena said quietly as she stepped back to a safe distance. Phoenix is starting to remember that he was born to be a horse, not a weapon. Carson felt tears in his eyes as he realized what Elena had accomplished. In 3 weeks, she had taken a horse that experts considered beyond hope and proven that even the most severe psychological damage could begin to heal with the right approach. But more than that, Elena had demonstrated her own complete transformation. From the desperate woman he'd first encountered to a professional, whose skills could literally mean the difference between life and death for animals no one else could reach. As they walked back toward the ranch house that evening, Carson found himself thinking about how much both Elena and Phoenix had changed since arriving at the ranch. Both had been written off by the world, both had survived unthinkable trauma, and both were proving that healing was possible even when the damage seemed irreversible. "Elena," Carson said as they reached her cabin, "I want you to know that what you've accomplished with Phoenix goes far beyond what we originally discussed. You're not just helping individual horses, you're proving that our entire approach to trauma rehabilitation can be more effective than anyone thought possible." Elena smiled, and Carson saw in her expression a confidence and sense of purpose that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. "Carson, this is what I was meant to do. Not just working with horses, but proving that healing is possible, even when everything seems hopeless. Phoenix is going to recover because someone was willing to see past his damage to the horse he still is inside." As Carson watched Elena disappear into her cabin, he realized that their story was far from over. Elena's work with Phoenix was just the beginning of something much larger, a transformation that would affect not just the horses they rescued, but their entire understanding of what it meant to help the broken find their way back to wholeness. Call came on a Tuesday morning in February, just as Elena was preparing for her daily session with Phoenix. Carson's phone rang with an unfamiliar number displaying a Virginia area code, and something in the caller's tone immediately set off alarm bells. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Detective James Rodriguez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm calling regarding Elena Fairfield. We have reason to believe she may be in your area." Carson felt his blood turn to ice as he glanced toward Elena's cabin, where smoke was rising from the chimney in the early morning air. Elena was probably brewing her morning coffee, preparing for another day of groundbreaking work with traumatized horses, completely unaware that her past had finally caught up with her. "I'm not familiar with that name," Carson said carefully, grateful for the legal advice he'd received about maintaining Elena's contractor status. "Mrs. Fairfield is wanted for questioning in connection with a federal fraud investigation," Detective Rodriguez continued. "We've received information suggesting she may be using an assumed identity and working with horses somewhere in Montana. Your ranch was mentioned as a possibility." Carson's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. Someone had provided specific enough information to point investigators toward horse operations in Montana, which suggested Elena's location wasn't as secure as they'd believed. "Detective Rodriguez, I employ several people who work with horses, but I'd need more specific information to know whether any of them match the person you're looking for." Mrs. Fairfield would be in her early 30s, with extensive experience in horse breeding and training. She was formerly married to Marcus Fairfield, who disappeared during a federal investigation into racing fraud and money laundering. Carson could hear Elena's voice in his memory, describing the same investigation that had destroyed her life. But he also remembered her insistence that she knew nothing about the missing money, and his absolute certainty that she was telling the truth. "Detective, if you could send me a photograph and more detailed information, I'd be happy to check my employee records and get back to you. Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your cooperation, but this is a time-sensitive matter. We have reason to believe Mrs. Fairfield may attempt to flee if she becomes aware of our investigation. We'll be arriving at your ranch this afternoon to conduct interviews." The call ended, leaving Carson with approximately 6 hours to decide how to handle a situation that could destroy everything Elena had rebuilt. He could warn her immediately, giving her time to disappear back into the wilderness she'd emerged from. Or he could trust that 5 years of federal investigation had failed to produce evidence of Elena's guilt, because no such evidence existed. Carson found Elena in Phoenix's paddock, sitting quietly on an overturned bucket while the stallion grazed peacefully nearby. The scene was so tranquil, such a testament to Elena's remarkable skill and patience, that Carson almost couldn't bring himself to shatter the moment with devastating news. "Elena," he said softly, not wanting to startle either her or Phoenix, "we need to talk." Something in his tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because Elena immediately rose and moved toward the paddock fence, her movements careful and controlled despite what Carson could see was growing alarm. "What's happened?" she asked as soon as they were out of Phoenix's hearing range. Carson explained the phone call, watching Elena's face grow pale as she absorbed the implications. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the mountains that had provided sanctuary for so many years. "They said someone gave them information about Montana horse operations," Elena said finally. "That means either someone recognized me despite my efforts to stay hidden, or Marcus has finally surfaced and is trying to direct attention away from himself." Carson felt a surge of protective anger. "Elena, you don't have to face this alone. We can contact a lawyer, arrange for proper representation before they arrive." Elena shook her head. "Carson, if I run now, you become an accessory to whatever they think I've done. And if I stay and they arrest me, I may never be able to return to this life we've built. Either way, this ranch and everyone connected to it becomes collateral. Damage in a war one never chose to fight." The weight of impossible choices settled between them. Carson could see Elena calculating risks and consequences with the same analytical approach she used for horse rehabilitation. But this time the stakes were her freedom and possibly her life. "There's another option," Elena said slowly. "I could contact them directly, arrange to meet somewhere neutral where I can answer their questions without exposing this ranch to scrutiny. If I'm completely honest about what I know and don't know, maybe I can convince them that I'm not the person they're really looking for." Carson felt his heart clench at the thought of Elena voluntarily walking into federal custody. "Elena, what if they don't believe you? What if they're under pressure to make an arrest regardless of the evidence? Then at least I'll have tried to resolve this honorably instead of running again," Elena replied. "Carson, I've spent 5 years hiding from this investigation, and it's finally found me anyway. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start fighting." Before Carson could respond, Miguel appeared at the edge of the paddock, his expression urgent. "Carson, there are 2 vehicles coming up the main road, government plates." Elena and Carson exchanged a look that contained 5 months of shared trust, professional respect, and growing affection. In that moment, Carson realized that what had begun as compassion for a desperate stranger had evolved into something much deeper, a partnership that had enriched both their lives in ways neither had expected. "Whatever happens," Carson said quietly, "I want you to know that having you here has been one of the best things that's ever happened to this ranch. What you've accomplished with these horses is remarkable, and who you've become is even more remarkable." Elena smiled, and Carson saw in her expression a peace that transcended the fear of what lay ahead. "Carson, you gave me back my life when I had forgotten I deserved one. Whatever happens now, I'll always be grateful for these months when I remembered who I was meant to be." The federal agents who emerged from the 2 black SUVs were professional, but clearly serious about their mission. Detective Rodriguez was a compact man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with complex investigations. His partner, Agent Sarah Walsh, appeared younger but equally focused. "Mr. Mitchell," Detective Rodriguez said, "we appreciate your cooperation. We'd like to begin by interviewing your employees who work with horses." Carson had made his decision during the 20 minutes between Miguel's warning and the agent's arrival. Detective Rodriguez, before we begin, I think you should know that Elena Fairfield contacted me this morning after somehow learning about your investigation. She's here, voluntarily and ready to answer your questions. Both agents tensed at this information, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, before relaxing as they realized Carson was offering cooperation rather than resistance. "Mrs. Fairfield is here now?" Agent Walsh asked. "She's waiting in my office," Carson confirmed. "She asked me to assure you that she has no intention of fleeing and is prepared to provide complete cooperation with your investigation." Elena had spent the intervening time preparing for what might be her final conversation as a free woman. She'd changed into the closest thing to professional attire she possessed, clean jeans and a button-down shirt that emphasized her dignity rather than her circumstances. More importantly, she'd organized her thoughts and evidence in preparation for what she knew would be the most important interview of her life. The federal agents found Elena sitting calmly at Carson's desk, a small stack of documents arranged neatly before her. Her posture was composed, professional, and completely unlike what they'd expected from someone who had been living as a fugitive for 5 years. "Mrs. Fairfield," Detective Rodriguez began, "you understand that you're not under arrest at this time, but you are a person of interest in a federal investigation. You have the right to have an attorney present during this interview." "I understand," Elena replied. "I've chosen to speak with you without legal representation because I believe the truth is my best defense, and I have nothing to hide regarding the matter you're investigating." Agent Walsh activated a digital recorder and began with basic identification questions, establishing Elena's identity and confirming her connection to Marcus Fairfield and the events under investigation. Elena answered each question directly and completely, her responses revealing both her intelligence and her complete familiarity with the case details. "Mrs. Fairfield," Detective Rodriguez said, "our investigation centers on approximately $2 million that disappeared from various accounts associated with your husband's business operations. Do you have any knowledge of what happened to these funds?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Detective Rodriguez, I learned about the missing money the same way you did, from federal agents who came to my farm 5 years ago, asking the same questions you're asking now. Marcus liquidated those accounts and disappeared without telling me about either action. You expect us to believe that you had no knowledge of your husband's financial activities, despite being a partner in the business." Elena's response revealed the depth of her preparation for this moment. "Agent Walsh, I've brought copies of our business partnership agreements, tax returns, and bank signature cards. You'll find that Marcus maintained complete control over all financial accounts. I was responsible for horse breeding, training, and sales operations. Marcus handled all monetary transactions." She slid several documents across the desk. "You'll also find copies of legal papers showing that I attempted to divorce Marcus 18 months before he disappeared, specifically because I discovered he was engaging in financial activities I couldn't support." This information was clearly new to the investigators, who spent several minutes examining Elena's documentation. Carson watched from a chair in the corner, amazed at Elena's composure and the thoroughness of her preparation. "Mrs. Fairfield," Detective Rodriguez said finally, "if you were innocent of wrongdoing, why did you disappear rather than cooperating with our investigation?" Elena's answer revealed the full tragedy of her situation. "Detective, I tried to cooperate. I spent 8 months answering questions, providing records, submitting to interrogations, and watching my entire life disintegrate while lawyers and accountants seized everything I owned. When I realized that cooperation wasn't leading to resolution, but was instead being used to pressure me into confessing to crimes I didn't commit, I chose to remove myself from a process that seemed designed to destroy me, regardless of my guilt or innocence." Agent Walsh leaned forward. "Mrs. Fairfield, we have reason to believe your husband may have recently made contact with you. Have you seen or heard from Marcus Fairfield since his disappearance? I have not seen, spoken with, or received any communication from Marcus Fairfield since he left our farm 5 years ago, Alina said firmly. I don't know where he is, I don't know how to contact him, and I have no access to any money he may have taken. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, with the agents probing every aspect of Alina's knowledge about the missing funds, her husband's activities, and her years in hiding. Throughout the interview, Alina maintained her composure and consistency, answering each question with specificity that demonstrated both her truthfulness and her complete lack of involvement in the financial crimes. Finally, Detective Rodriguez closed his notebook and turned off the recorder. Mrs. Fairfield, your answers today have been consistent with information we've developed from other sources. However, we may need to contact you again as our investigation continues. Alina nodded. Detective, I understand that this investigation needs to be completed thoroughly. I'm prepared to make myself available for any additional questions, and I want you to know that I hope Marcus is found and held accountable for what he did. After the federal agents left, Carson and Alina sat in his kitchen, both emotionally drained by the intensity of the interrogation. Alina seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of revisiting her past had temporarily diminished the confidence she'd rebuilt. How do you think it went? Carson asked. Alina considered the question carefully. I think they're beginning to understand that I'm not the person they originally thought I was. Whether that's enough to end their interest in me remains to be seen. Carson reached across the table and took Alina's hand, feeling the calluses. That spoke of her months of hard work with horses, the strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardship. Alina, regardless of what happens with the investigation, I want you to know that you have a place here for as long as you want it. What you've built with these horses, the person you've become, none of that changes because of questions about your past. Alina squeezed his hand gratefully. Carson, today reminded me how much my life has changed since I came here. 5 years ago, I would have been terrified during that interview, desperate to convince them of my innocence. Today, I felt sad about the past but confident about who I am now. That confidence came from the work we've done together and the life you helped me rebuild. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Carson realized that Alina's confrontation with her past had actually strengthened rather than weakened her connection to her present life. She had faced her accusers with dignity, answered their questions with honesty, and demonstrated that she was no longer the broken woman who had disappeared into the wilderness 5 years earlier. Whatever the investigation's outcome, Alina had proven to herself and everyone else that she was strong enough to face whatever came next. And Carson knew that the woman sitting beside him, professional, confident, and unafraid, was someone worth fighting for, whatever challenges lay ahead. 3 weeks after the federal interview, Alina received an unexpected phone call that would change everything once again. She was working with Phoenix in the early morning, quiet when her secure cell phone device Carson had insisted she carry buzzed with an unknown number. Alina Fairfield? The voice belonged to a woman with a slight southern accent. This is Alina, she replied cautiously, immediately alert to the possibility that this could be another law enforcement contact. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm an investigative journalist with the Washington Post. I've been following the Marcus Fairfield case for 3 years, and I believe I have information that could completely exonerate you. Alina felt her knees weaken. After years of assuming the worst about her situation, the possibility of actual vindication seemed almost too dangerous to hope for. What kind of information? Alina asked carefully. I've located Marcus, Rebecca said. He's been living in Costa Rica under an assumed identity, and he's been quite careless about his digital footprint lately. More importantly, I have evidence that proves you were deliberately kept in the dark about his financial crimes. Alina's mind raced as she processed this revelation. Marcus was alive, traceable, and apparently unaware that his location had been discovered. But more significantly, there was evidence that could prove her innocence, evidence she'd never known existed. "Ms. Martinez, why are you calling me instead of going directly to the authorities?" Rebecca's response revealed the complexity of investigative journalism in the digital age. "Elena, I've been tracking financial fraud cases for a decade, and I've seen how federal investigations can destroy innocent people, even when the truth eventually emerges. I wanted to give you the opportunity to understand what I found before this information becomes public." Elena sat down heavily on the paddock fence, Phoenix watching her with the alert concern horses showed when their humans displayed distress. "What exactly have you discovered?" Marcus maintained extensive encrypted communications with his primary conspirator, a man named David Chen, who handled the money laundering operations. "I've obtained copies of emails that explicitly discuss keeping you unaware of their activities. There are also recordings of phone conversations where Marcus brags about using your reputation to legitimize transactions while ensuring you couldn't implicate him if caught." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Not only had Marcus stolen money and abandoned her to face the consequences, but he had deliberately constructed the scheme to make her appear complicit while actually ensuring her ignorance. "Elena," Rebecca continued, "these communications make it clear that Marcus viewed you as an unwitting accomplice, someone whose legitimate business reputation provided cover for his crimes, but who was never intended to be a true partner in the fraud." Elena felt a complex mixture of vindication and betrayal. Learning that she had been deliberately manipulated was painful, but it also meant that her years of insisting on her innocence had been completely justified. "Ms. Martinez, what do you need from me?" "I'd like to interview you for my story, which will be published next week. But more importantly, I want to coordinate with federal authorities to ensure this evidence reaches the right people in a way that provides you with maximum protection." Elena's conversation with Rebecca Martinez lasted nearly an hour, during which she learned details about Marcus's activities that explained mysteries she'd puzzled over for years. Unexplained business trips, secretive phone calls, financial documents she'd been told were too complex for her to understand all, had been part of an elaborate deception designed to use her expertise while shielding her from knowledge that could have stopped the fraud. When Elena finally ended the call, she found Carson waiting anxiously nearby, having noticed her distressed posture from across the paddock. "Elena, what's happened?" Elena explained Rebecca Martinez's revelations, watching Carson's expression shift from concern to amazement to anger on her behalf. When she finished, Carson was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of this new information. "This changes everything," Carson said finally. "If this journalist has proof that Marcus deliberately kept you ignorant of his crimes, it doesn't just establish your innocence, it proves you were as much a victim as anyone else he defrauded." Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Carson, I keep thinking about all the people whose lives were destroyed by Marcus's actions. Investors who lost retirement savings, employees who lost their jobs, other horse breeders who were tarred by association with our operation, proving my innocence doesn't undo the damage that was done." Carson recognized the guilt Elena was expressing, the complex emotions of someone who had suffered, but still felt responsible for pain they hadn't caused. "Elena, you can't take responsibility for crimes you didn't commit or even know about. The people who were hurt deserve justice, and that justice starts with the truth about what really happened." Over the following days, Elena worked with Rebecca Martinez to provide background information for the investigative story while federal authorities reviewed the new evidence. The process was emotionally exhausting, requiring Elena to relive the worst period of her life while simultaneously processing the reality of how thoroughly she had been deceived. But there were also moments of profound relief as pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Financial transactions she'd signed without understanding their true purpose, business partners who had suddenly become distant and suspicious, Investigators' questions that had seemed designed to trap her, all of it now made sense in the context of Marcus's deliberate deception. Dr. Chun noticed Elena's emotional state during her weekly visit to check on the horses. "Elena, you seem to be carrying a heavy burden lately. Is there anything I can do to help?" Elena found herself sharing the story with Dr. Chun, whose reaction was both professionally supportive and personally outraged. "Elena, what you're describing is a form of financial abuse that's more common than people realize. Partners who use their spouse's reputation and expertise as cover for criminal activity often go to great lengths to ensure their victim can't expose them, even accidentally." Dr. Chun's perspective as someone who dealt with abuse in animal cases provided Elena with a framework for understanding her own experience. "You were systematically isolated from information that would have allowed you to protect yourself or others. That isolation was deliberate and designed to make you vulnerable to exactly what happened." The conversation with Dr. Chin helped Elena realize that her years of self-doubt about whether she should have somehow detected Marcus's criminal activity had been misplaced. She hadn't failed to notice warning signs. She had been deliberately prevented from seeing them. Elena's work with Phoenix became a source of both stability and metaphor during this period of upheaval. The stallion continued to make remarkable progress, now allowing Elena to groom him regularly and even accepting basic halter training. But more importantly, Phoenix seemed to sense Elena's emotional state and responded with unusual gentleness. "He knows you're hurting," Carson observed one morning as he watched Phoenix voluntarily approach Elena for attention. Traumatized animals often become very sensitive to emotional distress in the humans who help them. Elena stroked Phoenix's neck, drawing comfort from the contact with an animal who understood survival and recovery. "Sometimes I think Phoenix and I are healing each other. He's learning to trust humans again. And I'm learning to trust that the truth can actually set you free instead of destroying you." The Washington Post story broke on a Thursday morning with a headline that sent shockwaves through both the horse racing industry and federal law enforcement. "Hidden evidence reveals innocent wife was unwitting pawn in multi-million-dollar racing fraud." Rebecca Martinez's investigation was thorough and devastating in its implications. The article included excerpts from Marcus's communications that clearly demonstrated his intent to use Elena as an unknowing accomplice. Detailed financial analysis proving she had never benefited from the stolen funds, and expert testimony about the psychological manipulation tactics used to keep victims unaware of their exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, the story included Marcus's current location and evidence of his ongoing criminal activities in Costa Rica. Information that federal authorities used to coordinate his arrest within hours of the article's publication. Elena learned about Marcus's capture from Detective Rodriguez, who called personally to inform her of the development. "Mrs. Fairfield, I want you to know that the evidence provided by Ms. Martinez has completely corroborated your statements to us. Marcus Fairfield was arrested this morning in San Jose, and we expect him to be extradited within the next several weeks." Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions as she absorbed this news. Relief that Marcus would finally face consequences for his actions. Sadness that their marriage had been built on such fundamental deception. And overwhelming gratitude that the truth had finally emerged in a way that restored her reputation and freedom. "Detective Rodriguez," Elena said, "does this mean the investigation into my activities is closed?" "Mrs. Fairfield, based on the evidence now available, we are confident that you were an innocent victim of your husband's criminal enterprise. You should expect to receive official notification within the next few days that you are no longer considered a person of interest in this investigation." When Elena shared this news with Carson, Miguel, and Dr. Chen, their celebration was subdued, but deeply meaningful. These were people who had come to know Elena through her actions rather than her circumstances, who had witnessed her character and capabilities firsthand. "Elena," Carson said as they sat together that evening, I want you to know that learning about your innocence doesn't change my opinion of you. It just confirms what I already knew about who you are." Elena appreciated Carson's sentiment, but she also recognized that official vindication would change practical aspects of her life in ways that were both exciting and intimidating. "Carson, now that I'm no longer hiding from federal investigators, I have choices I haven't had in years. I could rebuild my business, return to Virginia, reconnect with people from my former life." Carson felt his heart skip a beat as he realized Elena might be considering leaving the ranch now that she was free to resume her previous life. "Elena, what do you want to do?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the paddock where Phoenix grazed peacefully in the evening light. "Carson, 5 years ago I lost everything I thought defined me, my business, my reputation, my place in the horse industry. But these months at your ranch have taught me that who I am isn't determined by what I own or even what other people think of me." She turned to face Carson directly. "The work we're doing here with traumatized horses isn't just rehabilitation, it's pioneering new approaches that could help animals no one else knows how to reach. Phoenix alone represents a breakthrough that could change how the entire industry handles extreme trauma cases." Carson felt hope rising in his chest as he began to understand the direction of Elena's thinking. "More than that," Elena continued, "I've learned that the most meaningful life isn't necessarily the most successful one by conventional standards. Here, with these horses and with you, I've found something I never had before, work that feels like calling rather than just career." Elena stood and walked to the window, where she could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of her small cabin. "Carson, I don't want to go back to my old life because I've discovered something better. I want to stay here and build something new, a comprehensive program for horses that other rescue operations consider hopeless." Carson joined her at the window, feeling as if his own healing was reaching completion. "Elena, I was hoping you'd say that. What you've accomplished here goes far beyond what any of us imagined possible. And what we could accomplish together could transform horse rescue work across the entire region." As they stood together watching the peaceful evening settle over the ranch, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate survival to professional fulfillment. She had lost everything once, but in rebuilding from nothing, she had discovered capabilities and purpose she'd never known she possessed. "Carson," Elena said quietly, "when I first came here, I thought I was just trying to survive until something better came along. I never imagined that something better would turn out to be becoming the person I was always meant to be." The vindication Elena had received from the investigation's resolution was important, but it paled in comparison to the self-respect she had earned through her work with damaged horses and her partnership with Carson. She had proven to herself that she was capable of not just surviving disaster, but of transforming it into something meaningful and valuable. As Elena prepared to return to her cabin that night, she realized that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, not a return to her old life, but the continuation of a story that had truly begun the day Carson Mitchell first saw her as a human being worth helping rather than a problem to be solved. 1 year later, Elena stood before a packed auditorium at Montana State University, delivering the keynote address at the Regional Equine Rehabilitation Conference. The transformation from the desperate woman who had once foraged through garbage cans to the respected professional addressing an audience of veterinarians, trainers, and rescue operators seemed impossible. Yet here she was, sharing groundbreaking research that was revolutionizing how the horse industry approached trauma recovery. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena began, her voice clear and confident, "I want to tell you about a stallion named Phoenix who taught me that the most profound healing often happens in the space between giving up and holding on." The presentation she delivered that day detailed methodologies that had already been adopted by rescue operations across 3 states. The Phoenix Protocol, as it had come to be known, provided systematic approaches for rehabilitating horses with extreme trauma histories. But more than just technical information, Elena's research offered hope for animals that had previously been considered beyond help. Carson watched from the front row, feeling immense pride as Elena described case studies that included not just Phoenix but Thunder, Duchess, and 6 other horses whose transformations had seemed impossible when they first arrived at the ranch. Each success story represented not just professional achievement, but proof that healing was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. The key insight, Elena explained to the rapt audience, is understanding that traumatized horses don't need us to fix them. They need us to create conditions where they can remember how to heal themselves. Our role is not to force trust, but to demonstrate consistently that trust is safe. During the question and answer session that followed, Elena fielded inquiries from professionals who had traveled from as far as California and Texas to learn about her techniques. Her responses revealed not just technical expertise, but a depth of understanding that could only come from someone who had experienced profound trauma and recovery personally. Dr. Fairfield asked a veterinarian from Denver, "Your success rates with severe trauma cases are unprecedented. What do you think makes your approach different from traditional rehabilitation methods?" Elena considered the question carefully before responding. "I think the difference is that I understand what it feels like to be written off by the world. When you've experienced that kind of abandonment yourself, you develop a different kind of patience with creatures who have been similarly discarded. You're willing to wait as long as it takes because you know that healing is possible, even when it seems impossible." The formal presentation concluded to sustained applause, but the real work of the conference happened during the informal conversations that followed. Elena found herself surrounded by professionals eager to collaborate, to learn, to contribute to research that was opening new possibilities for horse rescue work. Dr. Chun, who had driven from Millfield to attend Elena's presentation, observed the scene with satisfaction. "Elena, watching you today reminded me why I went into veterinary medicine in the first place. You're not just treating individual animals, you're changing how our entire profession thinks about recovery and resilience." But it was the conversation Elena had with a young woman named Katie Sullivan that proved most meaningful. Katie worked at a rescue operation in Idaho and had been struggling with a group of horses seized from a fighting ring similar to the one that had produced Phoenix. "Dr. Fairfield," Katie said, "I've read everything you've published about extreme trauma rehabilitation, but I'm having trouble believing these techniques can work with horses as damaged as the ones we're dealing with. They've been so brutalized that they attack anyone who comes near them." Elena recognized the doubt in Katie's voice, the same uncertainty she'd felt when Carson first suggested she could help horses that seemed beyond hope. "Katie, can I tell you something that isn't in any of my published research?" The younger woman nodded eagerly. 2 years ago, I was living in an abandoned farmhouse, eating from garbage cans, and had convinced myself that I was too damaged to ever be part of normal society again. I had been betrayed, abandoned, and broken in ways that seemed irreparable. But someone saw past my damage to the person I still was underneath, and gave me the space to remember who I was meant to be. Elena paused, seeing recognition dawn in Katie's eyes. "The horses you're working with aren't different from Phoenix, and Phoenix wasn't different from me. They're not broken beyond repair. They're protecting themselves the only way they know how. Your job isn't to fix them quickly. It's to prove to them, day after day, that protection isn't necessary anymore." Katie's eyes filled with tears as she absorbed Elena's words. "You're saying that my own belief in their potential is part of the treatment?" "I'm saying that sometimes the most important healing happens when someone refuses to give up on us, even when we've given up on ourselves." Elena replied, "The techniques I've developed work because they're based on the understanding that every creature, human or horse, deserves the chance to heal, regardless of how impossible that healing might seem." The conference concluded with Elena accepting an invitation to establish a formal research partnership with the university, which would provide funding and academic support for expanding her rehabilitation methods. But more importantly, she left knowing that her work was creating ripple effects that would benefit traumatized animals across the country. The drive back to the ranch took Elena and Carson through the same landscape where she'd first been discovered, though now it was dressed in the brilliant colors of autumn rather than the bleak brown of late fall. As they passed the abandoned Hartwell property, Elena asked Carson to stop. They stood together at the edge of the overgrown yard where Elena had once scratched out a desperate existence. The makeshift shelter she'd constructed was still visible. Among the trees, weathered and partially collapsed but somehow still standing. "It's hard to believe I lived there," Elena said quietly. "Not just the physical conditions, but the person I was then, so afraid, so convinced that I deserved nothing better than survival." Carson studied Elena's profile as she gazed at the remnants of her former life. The woman standing beside him bore little resemblance to the desperate creature he'd first encountered. Elena now carried herself with quiet confidence, spoke with authority earned through experience, and approached challenges with a combination of wisdom and optimism that commanded respect from everyone who met her. "Elena," Carson said, "do you ever regret the path that brought you here? If Marcus hadn't betrayed you, if the investigation hadn't forced you into hiding, you would never have experienced those years of hardship." Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering the question she'd asked herself many times. "Carson, I used to think that if I could go back and prevent everything that happened, I would do it without hesitation. But now I'm not so sure." She turned to face him directly. "The person I was before, successful but somewhat isolated, focused on achievement but not necessarily on meaning, that person might never have discovered what she was truly capable of. It took losing everything, I thought, to find me, to discover who I actually was underneath all the external accomplishments." Carson understood what Elena was expressing. Her transformation hadn't simply been about recovering from trauma. It had been about discovering capabilities and purpose she'd never known she possessed. "Besides," Elena continued with a smile, "that person would never have met you, never would have worked with Phoenix, never would have learned that the most rewarding life isn't necessarily the easiest one." As they drove back toward the ranch, Elena reflected on how dramatically her definition of success had changed. A year ago, success would have meant restoring her former business, reclaiming her position in the horse racing industry, and rebuilding the wealth and status she'd lost. Now success meant helping a traumatized stallion learn to trust again, developing techniques that could save animals others had written off, and building a life based on purpose rather than profit. The ranch came into view as they crested this hill that marked the boundary of Carson's property. In the evening light, Elena could see horses grazing peacefully in pastures that had become home to over 30 rescue animals. Phoenix stood in the paddock nearest the house, his coat gleaming with health, his posture relaxed and confident. "Look at him," Carson said, following Elena's gaze. 6 months ago, Phoenix was scheduled for euthanasia because experts considered him too dangerous to save. Tonight, he's one of the gentlest horses on the ranch." Elena smiled as she watched. Phoenix lifted his head and whinnied a greeting in their direction. The stallion's transformation paralleled her own journey from desperation to dignity, from isolation to integration, from surviving to thriving. That evening, Elena sat in her cabin, reviewing notes for a research paper she was preparing about long-term outcomes in extreme trauma rehabilitation. The cabin had evolved into a comfortable home office, with bookshelves lining the walls and research materials organized across a large desk Carson had built for her, but it was the personal touches that made the space truly hers. Photographs of horses she'd helped, awards from professional organizations, and correspondence from rescue operators around the country who were implementing her techniques. Most precious was a simple wooden carving Phoenix had left for her the day she'd discovered her natural artistic ability. A soft knock on her door interrupted Elena's work. Carson stood on her small porch, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the slight smile that had become so familiar and comforting. "I thought you might need a break from all that research," he said. Settling into the chair beside her desk. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, realizing she'd been working for hours without pause. "I'm trying to finish the analysis of Phoenix's recovery timeline for the journal article. His progress has been so remarkable that I want to make sure we document every stage properly." Carson studied Elena's face in the lamplight, seeing the focused intensity that characterized her approach to everything she cared about. "Elena, can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" Elena looked up from her notes, giving Carson her full attention. "Do you ever think about the future? Not just the research or the rescue work, but your personal future. What you want your life to look like in 5 or 10 years. Elena set down her pen and considered Carson's question seriously. The truth was that she'd become so focused on the present, on helping horses, developing techniques, building a meaningful life, that she barely allowed herself to imagine long-term possibilities. "Carson, for so many years I was afraid to plan beyond the next day because everything could change so quickly. Even after things stabilized here, I think I was afraid to hope for too much because losing everything once makes you cautious about investing in dreams." Elena paused, studying Carson's face and recognizing something in his expression that suggested this wasn't a casual question. "But lately," she continued, "I've been thinking that maybe I'm ready to start believing in permanent things again. Not just professional success, but personal happiness. The kind of life where you can make long-term plans because you trust that the foundation you're building on is solid." Carson felt his heart rate increase as he recognized Elena's words as an opening for the conversation he'd been hoping to have for months. "Elena," Carson said carefully, "what we've built together, professionally and personally, feels like the most important thing I've ever been part of. I know we started as 2 people helping each other through difficult circumstances, but it's become something much deeper than that." Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she realized where this conversation was leading. "Carson, you saved my life in ways that go far beyond providing food and shelter. You saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself, and you gave me the chance to discover who I really was." Carson reached across the small space between their chairs and took Elena's hand. "Elena, I love who you are, not just who you've become, but who you've always been underneath everything that tried to break you. I love your strength, your compassion, your refusal to give up on creatures others consider hopeless." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she heard Carson express feelings she'd been hoping for, but hadn't dared to expect. "Carson," Elena said, her voice soft with emotion, "I love you too. I love your gentleness with broken things, your patience with healing that takes time, your belief that every creature deserves respect and care." Carson squeezed Elena's hand gently. "Elena Fairfield, would you consider building a permanent life with me? Not just as professional partners, but as people who choose to face whatever comes next together." Elena's smile was radiant as she realized that Carson was offering her something she'd thought she'd lost forever, the chance to build a future based on love and mutual respect rather than survival and necessity. "Carson Mitchell," Elena replied, "I would be honored to build that life with you." As they sat together in the quiet evening, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. She had lost everything that once defined her, survived years of desperate hardship, and somehow discovered a life more meaningful than anything she'd previously imagined possible. Outside her cabin window, Phoenix grazed peacefully under the Montana stars, his own journey from hopelessness to healing complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses to help, new techniques to develop. But tonight, Elena allowed herself to simply appreciate the miracle of transformation, both her own and that of every broken creature who had learned to trust again. The woman who had once lived like an animal forgotten by the world and convinced of her own worthlessness, had discovered that healing was not only possible but could become the foundation for helping others find their way back to wholeness. In saving Phoenix, Elena had completed her own rescue. In choosing love over fear, she had proven that no one is ever too broken to build something beautiful from the pieces of their shattered life. And in the quiet peace of that Montana evening, surrounded by rescued horses and embraced by unconditional love, Elena finally understood what it meant to not just survive, but to truly live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.